I was watching a fairly old episode of The Agenda, a TV Ontario current affairs program, a while back that posed the debate topic, the meaning of man. One of the panelists was Professor of Psychology Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto, and he's been an essayist on The Agenda in the past, and I'm going to link to both The Meaning of Man and Peterson's Agenda Insight presentation, Goodbye to Good Men, down in the low bar for you guys to look at if you are interested. Anyway, the discussion had been prompted by this observation by Peterson on a previous installment of The Agenda.
See, the thing about being male is you have to voluntarily accept responsibility for a family. If you're a female, you don't have to do that, because as soon as you have a baby, you're basically forced into the position where you're going to take responsibility. But a male has to do that voluntarily. And the rewards for that, fundamentally, at least to me, for the new generation, seems to have vanished. There's very little privilege, there's very little payment, there's very little stability. And so I see a lot of young men wondering, what am I supposed to do, and why is it that I would do what I'm supposed to do in the future? What's the gain? And I don't really see what the gain is for many of them.
Now, the whole thing was quite interesting to me, considering this is mainstream media in Canada in 2011. One of the things that really struck me was that the contributions of Peterson and co-panelists Mark Regnaris, a professor of sociology at the U of T at Austin, and John Intini, senior editor of Maclean's magazine, they were quite grounded in sort of empirical reality and evidence-based observations, while Globe and Mail relationships columnist Micah Taube seemed to be all about feelings and fairness and the land of should. It was like the moment he opened his mouth, I knew he was a feminist, and that conviction was only confirmed when this obscenely paternalistic yet feministy suggestion dropped out of his mouth.
You know, if men lower some of their ambitions, I know that sounds ridiculous, but it actually makes it so that women can move up a bit, and then both can have this sort of flex time, can trade off, you know, working, or, you know, when one needs to go back to school. That's fairness. And
Now, he was rebuffed by Peterson more gently than I would have done, but at least Peterson's response was grounded solidly in the realm of what is possible. It's simply not possible to make some professions woman-friendly enough to allow women who want children and want to balance their dedication to family life with their dedication to work to compete with men in those arenas. It's just not possible to convince high-ambition men who can and want to work 60 to 80 hours a week to not do that. In any meritocracy, those who are the most brilliant and the most dedicated to the goal will generally rise, and those who prioritize other things will not. Now, part of me wonders how the discussion might have gone down, especially given the participation of a feminist relationship columnist, had the study demonstrating that when men do more housework and childcare, a couple has less sex, been published prior to the air date. Or maybe the one just recently that demonstrated that couples who share the housework are 50% more likely to divorce. Regardless of all of that, it seems clear to me that the way men are is largely determined by what women desire them to be, and that what women desire men to be often has very little to do with what feminists, or maybe even women in general, outwardly claim they want. Anyway, that discussion got me thinking about dominance hierarchies and sex, especially this bit from Peterson.
You know, you also have to ask yourself if men are going to marry high-status women. I mean, there's a good study that came out in Britain about 3 years ago showing that for every 15-point increase in IQ, a woman's chance of being married dropped by 30%. And that's because it's difficult. Like, I'm not complaining about the women, but the thing is, the more intelligent, the more attractive, and the more educated a woman is, the smaller the portion of the male population that she's willing to consider.
Oh, I see.
There's no doubt about that.
I thought you were going to say the other thing, which is that men are too intimidated by that, and therefore...
Well, that's the parallel argument. Of course they're too intimidated. And why
terrible.
wouldn't they be? They're out-competed.
Well, why wouldn't they be? Why should they be? Shouldn't they just be happy about the fact they've got somebody fantastic? Why should they be intimidated by being associated with somebody who's wonderful?
Well, partly because male confidence has a lot to do with dominance hierarchy status.
Got to get over that, don't you think?
I don't think it's possible.
Because it's biology.
It's not just human biology. It's biology across a much wider spread of species than just human.
And that got me thinking about a blog post by philosopher Anne Althouse that she posted quite a while ago, wherein she speculates that perhaps men are more driven to achieve power because power is what gets them access to sex. And I was thinking about all of these things and how they might relate to this little snippet from Stanford's lecture series on human behavioral biology taught by Robert Sapolsky.
Very interestingly, something we will hear more about next week or so is another region of the brain is involved in male sexual behavior, which is the amygdala. That's kind of interesting. The amygdala, we've already heard about amygdala, fear, anxiety, all of that, but the amygdala also plays a very major role in aggression. And there's a small domain of amygdaloid function in males that's involved in sexual behavior, involved in sexual motivation. Medial preoptic area is much more about sexual performance in males. Amygdala is much more about sexual motivation. And all sorts of people have speculated fairly reasonably, I think, that this may have something to do with the fact explaining why among humans it is far more likely to be males than females who go about confusing sexuality with aggression. That it's got something to do with this weird role of the amygdala in male sexual motivation, male sexual arousal.
Because that last little snippet of information has been bouncing around in my brain for months, trying to find a place to stick. I had originally considered, as Sapolsky implies, that male sexuality might be wired through the amygdala because men are required to engage in sexually proceptive behaviors. That is, it's men who approach women, men who express interest in a specific woman, men who must take on the greater burden of rejection risk, men who typically make the first move, men who propose marriage, all of that. In other words, to get sex, men have to be assertive in seeking it from women, and one could describe aggression as the extreme end of the assertiveness scale. Now, that's not to say that women don't engage in sex-seeking behaviors. Of course they do. In most of nature, the female's initial step in the dance, the step that actually almost always sets the entire thing in motion, that's to signal through a variety of visual, auditory, olfactory, and ritualized cues her potential sexual receptivity. If the giant swollen genitals and miasma of pheromones is what signals to male chimpanzees that a female is in estrus and willing to consider offers, human females engage in a range of more subtle visual displays and behavioral mannerisms to let the males in the vicinity know that they're unattached and interested in seeking potential partners. One of the most interesting things I've read is that you can predict where a woman is in her reproductive cycle by how overtly sexually she will present herself in her style of dress. The closer she is to ovulation, the higher the hemlines and the lower the necklines, if you get my drift. Now, what's beautiful about this female form of initiation is that it expresses itself passively, non-specifically, and sometimes quite subtly, leaving plenty of room for plausible deniability. This gives a woman leeway to convince others, and perhaps even herself, that even if she's dressed in such a way as to make herself very sexually attractive to men, that doesn't mean she wants men, or perhaps you specifically, to look at or approach her. A woman's most common strategy is, as I've said before, like putting on a broadcast, hoping the most attractive males will aim the laser pointers of their sexual proceptivity in her direction. And you see this all the time in nature. Females who passively seek sex by essentially putting out bait. She puts out a scent indicating she's in estrus and then just goes on about her business. The males actively seek sex by tracking and pursuing that female. She signals her receptivity. It's he who must approach. She indicates she's interested in sex, and then the sex comes to her. This is just how it works for a lot of species. And this seems to be the most common way things go down among humans, too. Even in cases where a woman signals her receptivity to a specific man with glances, body language, and smiles, it's generally the man who approaches and makes his interest and intentions clear. And the woman's non-committal form of initiation provides her plenty of opportunity to demur, or to insist she wasn't actually interested in the first place if she changes her mind. It also protects a woman from the potential decrease in her social status and perceived mate value that often accompanies an active, targeted sexual rejection. Consider it. There's a big difference, both emotionally and socially, between a woman, say, going to a club and not having any men hit on her, which is still a rejection when you think about it, and her making overt advances only to have those advances rebuffed by a man she has clearly indicated she desires. In the first instance, she can at least save face by saying there were no men there she fancied anyway, while in the second, she's exposed to the decrease in her status, self-esteem, and the esteem of others that comes with being found lacking by a specifically desired potential mate. Social proof is a two-way street, after all, and in the case of sex and making some moves, it's potentially much more disastrous for women than it is for men. Perceived mate value for both men and women is measured in terms of general desirability among a peer cohort. And an overt rejection is much more damaging to a woman's mate value than to a man's. In strictly biological terms, a woman who rejects a man is saying, "I'm not willing to invest 9 months of gestation, up to 4 years of lactation and heavy nurturing, and risk my life in return for 20 minutes of your time and a teaspoon of your genetic material that constantly regenerates, which is suspended in about 30 calories worth of cheap carbohydrates." A man who rejects a woman is saying, "I'm not willing to take 20 minutes out of my life to hand you a teaspoon of my genetic material that constantly regenerates and is suspended in about 20 calories or 30 calories of the mostly cheap carbohydrates in exchange for you investing over 4 years and risking your life." To exaggerate for effect, the woman is, in the strictest of biological terms, saying, "I'm not paying you 50 grand for your chocolate bar," while the man is saying, "I'm not willing to give you 50 cents for that Lexus." So when you kind of put it in those terms, is it any wonder that women seem to have a much bigger problem coping with direct and unequivocal sexual rejection, even though it happens very infrequently to them, than men do? Anyway, I was perfectly willing to consider that it was because males, not just human ones, usually have to make the first move, essentially that males must be sexually assertive with females if they're actually going to get any sex, that this could be why men's sexuality needed to be wired through the part of the brain strongly associated with aggression and do-or-die instincts. Women, in contrast, did not evolve this way because, at least in the initial stages of courtship, sexually proceptive behavior in women is 1, unnecessary, and 2, accompanied by a risk of rejection and the subsequent huge decrease in a woman's perceived mate value among her peer group. In other words, it would harm her more than it would help her. Now, the reasoning goes that males wired this way would have been more successful than males who were not, while females wired this way would have been potentially less successful than those who were not. And we know this has to be the case, at least in terms of A and Z, if not the letters in between, because this is how men and women are wired. And Sapolsky's speculation implied that this difference in wiring is a means of providing males an additional boost to the motivators required specifically to engage in sexually proceptive behaviors toward women. This requirement to engage in sexual proceptivity could be why, as Sapolsky suggested, men are more likely to confuse sex and aggression. Except they aren't. Because when we actually look objectively at sexual aggression, which could be described as the most extreme form of sexually proceptive behavior out there, we find that women are about as prone to this type of behavior as men are, if not more. Heck, in heterosexual relationships, women are actually more likely to engage in the most extreme forms, force or threats, to get sex from an unwilling partner. Numerous other surveys show that women are as likely as men to self-report having engaged in or having tried to engage in rapey behaviors, perhaps even more likely. In fact, while feminists toss around the scary statistic that 1 in 12 men admit to raping or being willing to rape, a number of similar studies asking women the same question come up with numbers like 1 in 8, or even 1 in 3. What seems to be the case is that sexual coercion is an as common and more socially normalized behavior in women. The victimization rates of men and women are similar, but in some self-report studies, more women report having engaged in such behaviors in the past, sometimes percentages as high as over 40%, while a typically smaller percentage of men tend to report having repeatedly engaged in such behaviors. This would lead me to speculate that a larger percentage of normal women than normal men engage in sexual aggression against unwilling partners, which would lead me to further speculate that sexual aggression may be more likely to be a pathology in men and would be considered much more typical in women. Now, it seems to be more the case that we view women as sexually passive and harmless and men as sexually predatory, and that this perception informs all of our responses to sexual aggression in the real world. It seems to be very much about the ingrained narrative of courtship that feels most natural to us as humans, female receptivity and male proceptivity, as well as value judgments on the level of harm done. I mean, we make a big deal about it when someone carjacks a Lexus, but not so much when they steal a chocolate bar. I mean, think for a moment about how differently we perceive someone, for instance, suggestively grabbing their genitals while making eye contact, depending on whether they're a man or a woman. With a woman, we consider her hypersexually receptive, and with a man, the exact same gesture is interpreted as hypersexually proceptive. She's signaling willingness or availability. Come get me, I'm ready for you. While he's signaling intent. I'm coming to get you. Her performance of the exact same action will not be perceived as sexual aggression, but his may very well be interpreted as exactly that. Similarly, if a random woman intentionally exposed her genitals, people would be amused by it or feel pity for her or think she was a loon or even be repulsed, while a man doing the exact same thing is much more likely to be viewed as aggressive and a threat. And while many of the studies on female sexual aggression imply in their discussion sections that this may be a new phenomenon in women, that feminism and the sexual revolution have emboldened women to behave aggressively when seeking sex, I have a hard time seeing female sexual aggression, something so biologically driven, as some new fashion that's only just come in vogue. In Genesis, chapter 19, verses 32 to 36, a man's daughter, Lot's daughters, ply him with wine so they can have sex with him and get pregnant by him. I can't imagine the Bible or any of the people of that day considered that to be rape, but that's what it was. And while I do believe the Bible is a work of fiction, I can't imagine a situation like this would have even entered the minds of its authors if it was never known to happen in real life, that women were never known to ply a man with alcohol so she can have her way with him. You know, what I'm getting at is the very same behavior is more likely to be interpreted as receptive if it's displayed by a woman, therefore passive and non-threatening and certainly not harmful, and proceptive if it's displayed by a man, therefore active and more likely to connote intent, aggression, and ill will. You know, I'm thinking we're programmed, either socially or biologically or both, to view male sexuality as inherently active and aggressive and female sexuality as inherently passive and non-aggressive. Which kind of makes me wonder how much more objectively sexually aggressive a woman would have to behave than a man to have people see that sexual aggression for what it is. So, what I'm looking at Sapolsky's suggestion that men are more likely to confuse sex and aggression, and I'm thinking things aren't as simple as he would like to believe, or most of us would like to believe. We think men are more likely to engage in sexual aggression, but that's simply not the case. More than that, you have to also consider some fairly recent research into the sexual fantasies of men and women, which indicate that men prefer submissive fantasies to dominant ones. In other words, in a fantasy where one person is the ravisher and the other person is the ravishee, men would rather, at least in their inner sexual landscape, be the latter than the former. In fact, even though women preferred submissive fantasies to dominant ones as well, men rated these particular types of fantasies higher on a numbered scale than women did. To be fair, men tended to rate all types of fantasies higher on a numbered scale than women did, but that's a video for another day. So, here we see that in defiance of common wisdom, in the privacy of their own thoughts, the place where men are the least trammeled by what women in society expect of them, men are more likely to confuse submission than aggression with sex. You know, and you also have to consider the direct link between a female's physical safety and well-being and her mate's reproductive success. To try to illustrate this very simply for the sake of doubters, let's consider the case of the praying mantis. In captivity, females have been observed to kill and eat males during the act of mating, but the reverse has never, to my knowledge, ever been observed. And while such inconsiderate behavior on the part of female mantises may be much more rare in the wild and usually precipitated by the fact that the female is very, very hungry, it exists there as well, but not the reverse. So let's look at the scenario dispassionately, concentrating on natural selection and a results-based paradigm. Females have evolved an instinct to kill and eat males during mating if necessary, that is, if they are in danger of starvation. Males have not only not evolved a tendency to do the same to females, they've not even evolved any mechanism towards self-defense when a female decides to make a meal of them. In fact, they have apparently evolved some mechanism to subvert their normal survival instincts specifically during mating, in favor of prioritizing the nutritional requirements of their mate. Why would this be? Well, if a female is very, very hungry and a male is already inseminating her, it's actually in his best genetic interest to sacrifice himself, to allow her to have him for lunch. As long as his sperm are fertilizing her eggs, if he serves himself up in this way, he's a winner. The propagation of his genes is only assisted by him letting the female have her wicked cannibalistic way with him, isn't it? That's 100 or 200 babies that are better off than they were before he provided their mother a much-needed dinner. Every calorie of his body she consumes is a calorie devoted to the increased viability of his offspring. A male praying mantis would not have evolved an instinct to protect himself from this female behavior, even if it was common. At the same time, a female and her offspring would only benefit from turning a typical praying mantis male into an investment-oriented father by eating him if she was hungry enough, and she'd have evolved a mechanism that would allow her to do just that, if need be. For praying mantises, natural selection would pass down the willingness to cannibalize during mating for females and the willingness to be cannibalized during mating for males, simply because those behaviors led to greater reproductive success for both males and females. And humans may not be praying mantises, but a woman's physical safety and well-being are integral to her mate's reproductive success because she is the one who gestates the fetus, while a man's physical safety and well-being are simply not as directly important to his mate's reproductive success. This is going to be the case whether the mating that is occurring is consensual or not, in either direction. Which might be one of the reasons RAINN, the Rape and Incest National Network, as feminist a website as you can find, recommends women both verbally and physically resist rapists, since in the vast majority of cases, verbal and physical resistance will prevent an attempted rape from becoming a completed one. Given the strength differential between men and women and how violent men are known to be, it is conceivable that when faced with serious physical resistance, a rapist will abandon the attempt not to avoid injury to himself, but to prevent the level of catastrophic injury that might be necessary to subdue his victim. It might also go a long way toward explaining why virtually every man I've ever spoken to who has been raped by a woman did not physically resist her. Every single one I've spoken to who did not resist expressed a reluctance to do so out of concern over serious injury to the woman raping him. It might also interest feminists to know that the majority of convicted male rapists who acted out of displaced anger, the ones who are the most likely to commit sexual homicides or to inflict severe injury and cruelty on their victims, were abused physically or sexually by a woman during their childhood. There is an argument to be made that male misogynists and rapists are made, not born, and that they're often made by women. Women like Lot's daughters from that chapter in Genesis, who often justify their rapes of men and boys by telling themselves they're doing the guy a favor. And why wouldn't they tell themselves that? They're giving him a ride in a Lexus and only shaking him down for a chocolate bar. Statistics tell us that the majority of all aggression, whether male or female perpetrated, is perpetrated on men, and that the most violent and needlessly cruel and socially normalized forms of aggression, whether male or female perpetrated, are perpetrated on men. None of this indicates that men have a greater problem with confusing sex and aggression. It indicates a societal problem with seeing and addressing female sexual aggression for what it is. Now, if the different wiring of male sexuality had the effect of facilitating sexually proceptive behaviors in men, we would, one would think, see major sex differences in rates of employing the most extreme form of sexual proceptivity of all, sexual aggression. But we don't. Which is why that little soundbite of Sapolsky's stuck in my head, and why it produced quite a bit of an obsession over the question. If it doesn't do that, then what the fuck does it do? And when I watched that installment of The Agenda, and remembered Ann Althouse's blog post, it sent me off in a completely different direction to see if I couldn't come up with a hypothesis. And I want to state right here that that's what's about to follow, a hypothesis, a conjecture that fits the facts, but is still just a conjecture. And I will leave it to the more scientifically minded to find out if there's anything to it.